right, in your supply kit, you will have received 2 pieces of tracing paper, and one of those sheets of tracing paper is for your sketchbook if you so choose to use it. Now, I find having a sheet of tracing paper really beneficial if you're working with any material that tends to smear or smudge. And Oil Pastel is notorious for doing that. So to keep my work a little bit neater, I like to use the tracing paper for that purpose. All right. Also in your supply kit, you would have received a smaller piece of watercolor paper. This is what you're going to use for your media study, and you can use both sides if you so choose. So one side you can practice with the media and then flip it over, and the other side you can work on your media study, like my example of the moose. You also received an additional sheet of tracing paper. So this is your cover sheet for your final. You can take some simple tape and tape it to one edge, and while you are working, you can remove your cover sheet or lift it up behind your work, okay? And then when you're ready to kind of tuck it away or put it away for safekeeping, you can then cover your work once again. So for today's demonstration, instead of working on the smaller piece of paper, I'm actually going to demonstrate on a larger sheet of paper just so you can see what I'm doing a little easier. And I can work a little larger as well. So the other thing that you received in your supply kit were 12 different oil pastel colors, and you also received 2 water brushes. So what is special and unique about these brushes is they're not just a regular brush. I mean, you can use them like a regular brush and dip them in water, but you can also unscrew them, open it up, fill this with water, and then you actually have a water brush. This is great if you are on the go and you want to do things like watercolor outside or things like that, where you have everything all you need kind of in one tool. You'll notice that you got 2 different water brushes. This one is called a round brush because the tip comes to a point or it's more rounded. This one is called a flat brush because you have kind of this flat edge here on the end. So the flat brush, as you can probably tell, is really good for larger surfaces or larger areas, and your round brush is great for detail. Now, I know that not all of these brushes are working or functioning properly, so if you notice, after you fill your paintbrush or water brush up, you should notice that when you go to squeeze it, so when you squeeze the brush, the water should trickle and fill in this area, and then your brush should feel wet. If you notice that it's not filling up here, or if you have water that's leaking out of here or in another spot, then that means that your brush, your water pen or water brush, got broken in the process of being transported here. So I do apologize, but you know, these things do happen. Then if that's the case, then just use it like you would any ordinary brush, and that is totally fine. Okay, so now that we've covered all these supplies, let's now talk about how to work with them. So one of the colors that I love working with when I'm practicing is usually a bright, darker color because it's a lot easier to see what's happening. If, for instance, I experimented with the yellow, sometimes yellow is so bright and light, it's hard to see how it's working or functioning. And then sometimes when you work with a really dark color, you have the same problem on the opposite end. So for the purposes of this demo, I'm just going to work with the bright blue. You are welcome to work with any and all the colors, and I strongly encourage you to do so because that's how you're going to really figure out how do they work together, how do they blend together, what kind of colors can you make. So there are lots of different ways you can experiment with this. So I'm just going to start off making a couple of circles. Okay. So I'm also going to wet a spot. So my paper right now, I just added some water to it. And when you add water to the paper, it really makes the oil pastel kind of melt and feel like butter. Okay, so you should notice a huge difference between this one that had water prepared on the surface. So it was the paper that was wet and the crayon was dry. This one, the crayon is dry and the paper is dry. So both of these have that. I'm gonna add some water to this one. So this one already had, it was on dry paper with a dry crayon, and now let's add some water. Oh, another helpful handy hint or tip is to always have a paper towel nearby. So that way, as you're working, especially if you notice that you have too much water on your brush, you can dab your brush as you go. So now I'm adding that water to my oil pastel, and you should see that it's starting to kind of dissolve. Okay, so it's getting kind of milky and it's looking a lot more like a watercolor. So that's one of the things that I really enjoy with these oil pastels is just by doing 3 different methods. So this is a dry crayon on dry paper. This is dry crayon and then I've added water to it. This one, the paper was wet, but the crayon was dry. So now let's try out if I dip my crayon in water. So now my crayon is nice and wet. You can see it's kind of drippy. Now I'm going to work with a wet crayon on the dry paper. And it's going to feel really, like it kind of feels like it's sort of melting as I'm working with it. It's not quite as smooth as it was working with when the paper was wet, but it's definitely a lot smoother than when it's 100% dry. Okay, so I'm gonna keep working. This is drying. All right, I'm gonna dab this to help dry off my crayon. Okay. So another thing that's awesome about any pastel is that if you really build up the color or build up the tone, you can take your fingernail or you can take even a paper clip or anything like that that you can scratch into the surface. So this technique is called sgraffito. So you can actually scratch in to your oil pastel and remove some of that oil pastel or that layer. Okay, I'm going to do that again. This time I'm actually going to try to draw a little design in it. All right, this time I did some squiggles. Okay, so that's something that's really fun and interesting to do with oil pastels as well. So this is a wide variety of ways of working, and this is only with one color. Now let's say I want to add a second color. So I'm going to start building up my colors. One of the things too is that you don't really need to press super hard. By layering your color or by like adding a little bit of extra pressure, and building up that waxiness, like it gives you a little bit more freedom as you're building your color and color tones. So obviously yellow and blue make green. And one side I'm making more of a yellowy green, and the other side I'm making more of a bluishy green, depending on the amount. You can blend these a little bit with your fingers. It's not super, it's not going to be as smooth as it would if you were trying to add some water to that. You can see here, you're getting kind of a rough texture. So this is really great, especially if you're trying to do something like grass or fur or something that might be a little bit rough on the surface. All right, so the next thing that you will want to do is work on your media study. So for your media study, you're going to want to sketch in pencil. I'm sketching in pen, just so you guys can see it better. So you want to sketch lightly in pencil. I'm going to just do a simple apple for the sake of time, just so you can see what is happening. I'm going to put my light source. It's going to be over here, falling in this direction. So that means that my shadow is going to happen on this side. So when I'm working with my apple, one of the big things you want to avoid is don't just color the whole apple. You're like, oh my gosh, apples are red, so I'll just color the whole thing red and call it a day. No, let's not do that. Let's make sure that you're adding in tints and shades. So that means lights and darks, and adding in those values. So to make the red seem less bright or more dull, you can add a complement. So the complement of red is green. So this will end up looking a little bit darker and not quite as bright. And also it helps give me some of those darks without adding black. So if you can avoid using black as much as possible, because black tends to dull out your colors. Now, if you want to use a little bit, obviously to make something a little darker, or to really give like a nice dark tone, you can definitely do that. But just in general, try to minimize how much you use black. All right, so I'm going to come back in with some orange to deepen my color and deepen my tone. I'm going to come in with some yellow, especially where I'm kind of coming into my highlight area. I'm going to add some white. Now the white will never get like a pure white, so if you want a super bright highlight, you're going to have to add or leave the white of the paper. So I'm going to push my shadow a little bit more in here. Normally there's a reflective shadow that also happens, so I'm trying to build and push that as well. So you'll notice as I'm working, I'm building the colors slowly and steadily over time. I'm not just pushing down straight hard to fill in all the spaces. I'm letting the colors kind of blend naturally and fill them in themselves. So I find like, at least for the way that I like to work, I like to kind of lay down the colors first. If I want to work with some water, usually I won't build it up all the way. I'll leave some white space, and then I'll come back in with some water and start to dissolve and blend my colors and blend my tones. Grab some water. So as you can see here, my colors are really starting to blend nicely together. and my colors don't look just like flat and boring. Okay, so you can kind of get a sense of how this is coming together. While it is still wet, I think I want to push a little bit more, like a really subtle highlight in through here. Just a little. And maybe I will push my dart in through here. Just a little more. And add my shadow. So I'm going to do a cast shadow with a little bit of purple and blue. Just a touch or a hint of black. And then some green and red in here as well. Just so some of that color is being reflected onto the surface. Okay, so now what I want to do is I want to smooth this out. Now I can also leave this a little bit rough as is, and that would be fine. A little bit more water. And there you have it. So now you can see that I played with my media study. Here are a lot of the different ways I was working. So here is a review. So this was the oil pastel, just plain and simple on the paper that was dry. Then we have the oil pastel, and I added water to it. Then here, the oil pastel was added to wet paper. Then I dipped the oil pastel and drew with it, and it's a little bit, it's not as smooth as this one, but it's definitely a lot smoother than if it's just straight on the dry paper. Then I scratched away into the surface with these two, and then I played with a little bit of color blending. And then here is my study of an apple. It's not the greatest, but you start to get the sense of how do the colors work together. I don't just have one single color. I have a blend of colors. You're starting to see some texture emerge, where I have some rough and also some smooth that's happening at the same time. And this hopefully was a helpful tutorial on how to work with the oil pastels.